Captain James Carter stood at the airport gate, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. In his hands, he carried a folded flag, the weight of duty pressing on his shoulders. He was escorting the remains of Private Daniel Brooks, a young soldier who had paid the ultimate price for his country. As he approached the boarding area, an airline representative stepped forward, her expression firm but apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have policies. The casket will be transported separately, and you'll need to board like all other passengers." James straightened. "With all due respect, ma'am, I'm not just a passenger. I am this soldier's escort." I made a promise to his family that he would not be alone. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I understand, but we have strict regulations. If we make an exception." Before she could finish, a deep voice interrupted. A middle-aged man in a business suit had been listening. "Excuse me, but are you seriously telling a military officer he can't do his duty?" Murmurs spread among the waiting passengers. A woman with a child clutched her son's hand, her eyes misty. An elderly veteran adjusted his hat and stepped forward. "Son, I don't think this is the kind of country we fought for." A younger man, wearing a college sweatshirt, pulled out his phone. "I'm live streaming this. Let's see how your airline handles a hero being disrespected." The airline worker looked around, suddenly aware of the growing crowd. Her radio crackled as a manager's voice asked what was happening. She hesitated, then took a breath. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice softer now, "please follow me. We'll make sure you and Private Brooks travel together." As James walked down the jet bridge, the passengers erupted into applause. Some stood, others saluted. A few wiped their eyes. As the plane took off, James sat near the window, looking out at the sky. Private Brooks was going home with honor. And for that, James was grateful. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Captain James Carter exhaled, allowing himself a moment of reflection. The weight of his duty never truly left him, but knowing that Private Brooks was receiving the respect he deserved eased his heart, if only slightly. A flight attendant approached, her voice hushed with reverence. "Sir, the captain would like to extend his condolences. If you need anything, please let us know." James nodded. "Thank you. Just making sure he gets home properly, that's all that matters." The passengers remained unusually quiet. Even the usual chatter of a full flight was subdued, as if everyone aboard understood the gravity of the moment. Halfway through the flight, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special passenger among us today. Captain James Carter is escorting Private Daniel Brooks, who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We ask that you take a moment to honor him." Silence filled the cabin. Then, slowly, one by one, passengers placed their hands over their hearts. A soft sniffle came from the back. An older gentleman in first class, a retired Marine, removed his cap and held it against his chest. When the plane finally landed, James prepared himself for what was to come. The family would be waiting, hearts heavy with grief, yet proud of their son's service. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, the pilot's voice came on again. "Out of respect for Private Brooks, we ask that all passengers remain seated until he has been escorted off the plane." No one moved. No one complained. Instead, as James stood and made his way toward the front, he felt hands pat his shoulder, silent gestures of gratitude and support. The cargo hold opened, revealing the flag-draped casket. A military honor guard stood ready. On the tarmac, Private Brooks' family waited, their faces etched with sorrow and pride. James took a steady breath and stepped forward, fulfilling the final duty he owed his fallen brother. As he handed the folded flag to Private Brooks' mother, she clutched it to her chest, tears falling freely. "Thank you for bringing him home." James, his voice thick with emotion, responded with the only words that truly mattered. "It was my honor." As James stepped back, allowing the family their moment, he could see the pain in their eyes, an unbearable grief mixed with unwavering pride. Private Brooks' father, a man who had clearly seen his share of hardships, held his wife close, his jaw clenched to keep his emotions in check. His younger sister, barely a teenager, wiped her tears but stood tall, as if trying to honor her brother the best way she knew how. The honor guard moved with precision, lifting the casket with solemn reverence. The American flag draped over it fluttered slightly in the breeze. A military chaplain stepped forward, offering a quiet prayer, and the family listened, their hands clasped tightly together. James felt a presence beside him. Turning, he saw the elderly Marine from the plane. He had made his way down to the tarmac, his hat back on, his spine straight despite his age. "Didn't feel right just watching from the window," the man said gruffly. "Figured I'd stand with you." James gave a small nod of appreciation. As the casket was placed into the hearse, the airline employees who had once questioned James' presence now stood at attention, their expressions somber. The same airline representative who had tried to stop him at the gate approached hesitantly. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't understand. But I do now." James studied her for a moment, then simply said, "Just remember him." She nodded, her eyes glistening. As the hearse doors closed, the Brooks family turned to James once more. "Will you be coming to the funeral?" Mrs. Brooks asked, her voice trembling. James had planned to return to his base immediately, but something in her eyes, something in the weight of the folded flag she still clutched, made him change his mind. "Yes, ma'am," he said firmly. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." 3 days later, under a gray sky, James stood in full dress uniform as the rifle salute echoed across the cemetery. The folded flag was once again in his hands, and when he placed it in Mrs. Brooks' lap, she squeezed his fingers, as if drawing strength from the gesture. As the final notes of "taps" faded into silence, James took a step back, standing at attention. Private Daniel Brooks was finally home. And he would never be forgotten. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed, James lingered near the grave. He watched as the Brooks family remained seated, unwilling to leave just yet. Mrs. Brooks gently ran her hand over the smooth wood of the casket, whispering something too soft for James to hear. The younger sister, Emily, stood a few feet away, clutching a small notebook. After a moment's hesitation, she approached James. "Captain Carter," she asked, her voice quiet but steady. James turned to her and offered a gentle nod. "Yes." She bit her lip, glancing down at her notebook before holding it out to him. I wrote something for Danny. Would you like to read it?" James accepted the notebook carefully, flipping it open to the page she had marked. Her handwriting was neat but slightly uneven, as if she had written it in a hurry, afraid she might lose the words. "My big brother always told me to be strong. He told me that no matter how hard things got, I should stand tall, just like he did. Today, I don't feel strong. I feel like a piece of my heart is gone. But I know Danny wouldn't want me to cry forever. So I promise I will try to be strong. I will remember his laugh, his stupid jokes, the way he always made me feel safe. And I will tell his story, so the world never forgets how brave he was." James swallowed hard, the words hitting him deeper than he expected. He handed the notebook back to her. "He would be proud of you, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She gave him a small, brave smile. "Thank you for bringing him home." James nodded. "It was my honor." As the Brooks family finally rose to leave, James knew his duty here was done. But this wasn't just another mission. This wasn't something he would forget once he returned to base. Before turning away, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his own small notebook. He flipped to a fresh page and, with steady hands, wrote a name, Private Daniel Brooks. He would keep this list with him always, a list of names, of fallen brothers and sisters, of those who had given everything. A reminder of why he wore the uniform. A promise that none of them would ever be forgotten. As James walked back toward his car, he felt the weight of the day settle in his chest. The echoes of the rifle salute still rang in his ears, and Emily's words lingered in his mind. Before he could leave, Private Brooks' father approached him. The man's posture was stiff, his weathered hands clenched at his sides, but his eyes held a quiet gratitude. "I served in Desert Storm," Mr. Brooks said, his voice rough. "I know what it means to bring a brother home. You did right by my son." James met his gaze and extended a firm handshake. "He was a good soldier, sir. He deserved every honor today." The older man gripped his hand tightly before releasing it. "I know you have to get back to your duty, but if you're ever in town again," he hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Well, you've got a place at our table." James felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just an offer of hospitality, it was an invitation into their family, an acknowledgement that his role in Private Brooks' journey home would never be forgotten. "I'd be honored, sir," James replied. With one final nod, Mr. Brooks turned back toward his family, placing a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. James climbed into his car, but before starting the engine, he pulled out his notebook again. Beneath Private Brooks' name, he added a single word: family. As he drove away from the cemetery, the sun breaking through the clouds, James knew this wouldn't be the last time he thought about Private Brooks, Emily, or the Brooks family. Some people came into your life for a reason, even if only for a brief moment. And some names weren't just written down in a notebook. They were etched into the heart forever. A few weeks passed, but Private Brooks' name never left James' thoughts. His duties as an officer continued, new missions demanded his attention, but every so often, he would find himself flipping open that notebook, tracing the name with his fingers. One evening, after a long day of training exercises, James sat in his quarters, staring at the folded letter he had been meaning to send. It was addressed to the Brooks family, specifically to Emily. He had thought about what to say for days. He wasn't good with words, but he wanted her to know that her brother's sacrifice hadn't been forgotten. Taking a deep breath, he unfolded the letter and read it once more. "Dear Emily, I wanted to thank you for letting me be part of your brother's journey home. I know how much he meant to you, and I hope you never forget how much he loved you. The words you wrote about him at the funeral, they stayed with me. I keep them in my mind, the same way I keep his name in my notebook. You said you wanted to be strong, and I believe you already are. Strength isn't about not crying, it's about carrying on despite the pain." Private Brooks was a hero, not just because he wore the uniform, but because he was the kind of person who inspired others. "I see that same strength in you. Keep telling his story, Emily. The world needs to hear it. If you ever need anything, I'll be here. With respect, Captain James Carter." He let out a slow breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, before heading out for duty, he dropped it in the mail. Life moved on, as it always did, but a few weeks later, James returned to his quarters after a late-night briefing and found an envelope on his desk. His name was written in neat, slightly uneven handwriting. He knew before opening it who it was from. "Dear Captain Carter, thank you for your letter. It meant a lot to me. I still miss Danny every day, but I'm trying to keep my promise, to be strong. I tell his story to my friends, my teachers, even strangers who ask about the bracelet I wear with his name on it. People listen, and it makes me feel like he's still here in some way. You were right, strength isn't about not crying. It's about remembering and carrying on. Thank you for remembering my brother. Thank you for bringing him. And thank you for keeping his name in your notebook. With gratitude. Emily Brooks." James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Some names stayed with you forever. And Private Daniel Brooks' name would never fade. Months passed, and the seasons changed, but Captain James Carter still carried Private Daniel Brooks with him. His days were filled with new missions, training new recruits, and standing shoulder to shoulder with the men and women who shared his duty. But on quiet nights, when the world slowed down, he would open his notebook and run his fingers over the names written inside. One evening, as he sat alone in his quarters, his phone buzzed with a message. It was an unknown number, but as soon as he opened it, he recognized the words. "I told you I'd keep telling his story." Attached was a picture of Emily Brooks standing in front of her school auditorium, holding a piece of paper, her speech. Behind her, a banner read, "Honoring Our Heroes, the Legacy of Private Daniel Brooks." James stared at the image for a long moment, a quiet pride settling in his chest. Emily had kept her promise. Before he could respond, another message came through. This time, it was from her father. "Captain Carter, we're having a memorial service for Danny's birthday next month. It would mean a lot if you could be there." James didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't miss it." A month later, James found himself in front of the Brooks family home. It was a modest house, a white picket fence lining the yard, an American flag waving gently in the breeze. He stepped out of his car, straightened his uniform, and made his way to the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Emily stood there, her eyes lighting up. "You came." James smiled. "Of course." She stepped aside, letting him in. The house was filled with family and friends, laughter mixing with quiet moments of remembrance. Photos of Daniel lined the walls, pictures of him as a child, as a teenager, and finally, in uniform. Mr. Brooks approached him, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. "Glad you're here, son." Mrs. Brooks, standing beside him, reached for James' hands. "Thank you for keeping your promise." James shook his head. "I just did what he deserved." She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "That's what makes it mean so much." The service was simple but beautiful. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, and memories of Daniel filled the room. When it was James' turn to speak, he pulled out his notebook. "I carry this with me everywhere," he said, holding it up. "It holds the names of those who should never be forgotten. And Daniel Brooks' name is right here. Emily S.M." As the night went on, James sat with the Brooks family, sharing stories and memories. He wasn't just a soldier escorting a fallen brother anymore. He was part of something bigger, a bond that couldn't be broken by time or distance. When he finally left, stepping into the cool night air, he looked up at the sky. Private Daniel Brooks was gone, but his legacy was alive. And James Carter would make sure it stayed that way. As James drove away from the Brooks home that night, he felt something settle deep in his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. A sense of peace. In his years of service, he had escorted more fallen soldiers than he cared to count. Each one left a mark, but Private Daniel Brooks had been different. His story had become more than just another name in a notebook. It had become a reminder of why James wore the uniform. A few weeks later, James was back on base when he received an unexpected envelope in the mail. The return address read, "The Brooks Family." Inside, he found a small, laminated card. On one side was a picture of Private Brooks in uniform, standing tall and proud. On the other side, a message was printed in neat, careful letters. "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear boots, carry rifles, and watch over us even when we can't see them. Thank you for watching over Danny, and for making sure his name will always be remembered. With love and gratitude, the Brooks family." Tucked behind the card was something else, a bracelet, identical to the one Emily had worn at the funeral. It was simple, black, with silver engraving that read, "PVT Daniel Brooks, never forgotten." James swallowed hard, running his thumb over the engraving. He wasn't the sentimental type, but this was different. That night, as he prepared for bed, he slid the bracelet onto his wrist. It fit perfectly. From that moment on, James never took it off. Years passed. Missions came and went. Soldiers were trained, battles were fought, and names were added to James' notebook. But no matter where he went, whether it was a war zone or a quiet base in the middle of nowhere, one thing remained constant. The bracelet never left his wrist. And Private Daniel Brooks' name never left his heart. Years passed, and time did what it always did, it moved forward. But some memories refused to fade. Captain James Carter had been promoted twice since the day he brought Private Daniel Brooks home. Now a major, he carried more responsibility, trained more soldiers, and led more missions. He had been stationed in different parts of the world, seen the best and worst of humanity, and continued to write names in his notebook. But one thing never changed. The black bracelet on his wrist remained. One afternoon, James was sitting in his office on base when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered, his voice steady. Major Carter. A familiar voice came through, slightly deeper but still unmistakable. Major Carter, it's Emily Brooks. James sat up straighter. Emily. It's good to hear from you. She let out a small laugh. I guess it's been a while, huh? Yeah. It has. He glanced at his wrist, at the bracelet with her brother's name. How are you? I'm good. I wanted to tell you something. She took a deep breath. I joined the army. James blinked, surprised. Then, a slow smile formed on his lips. You did? Yeah. I ship out for basic training in 2 weeks. James leaned back in his chair, pride swelling in his chest. Your brother would be damn proud of you. She hesitated, then said, I hope so. I wanted you to know. You were part of this decision. The way you honored him, the way you kept his memory alive, it made me want to be part of something bigger. James nodded, even though she couldn't see it. You're already part of something bigger, Emily. You always have been. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, thank you. For everything. James glanced down at his notebook, at the list of names that had grown over the years. No, he said. Thank you. Months later, James stood at a military graduation ceremony, watching as a new group of soldiers completed their training. And there, standing in formation, was Private Emily Brooks. She stood tall, just like her brother once had, and as their eyes met across the crowd, she lifted her wrist slightly, revealing a familiar black bracelet. James smiled. Some names never faded. Some legacies never died. And Private Daniel Brooks would never be forgotten.